What is your view of the international system? For example, someone like John Mearsheimer views it as anarchic. What is your conception? Those are my two questions to begin with.
Well, as you can probably guess, I don't love labels because I think that they oversimplify. So I like to describe things either in paragraphs or articles or books. But basically, I believe that peace and international cooperation are vital and achievable. And the difference between me and John Mearsheimer, who I admire enormously and like very much as an individual and like as a personal friend, is that he believes that in the anarchic relations of governments, tragedy is inevitable. His great text is called The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. And his view is that because there is so much insecurity in an anarchic world, great powers are bound not only to jostle with each other, but to struggle for dominance. And if two are struggling for dominance, one wins and one loses. The setup is a zero sum, or I would say a negative sum game. In fact, the title, Tragedy, suggests a negative sum game where the struggle goes on and in some sense a disaster ensues. So he believes that. I believe that cooperation is possible and vital. John gets a lot of credit, in my view, for accurate predictions. And I can mention several, but two that I would mention are his predictions that U.S. foreign policy vis-a-vis Russia, and specifically in Ukraine, would lead us to confrontation. He gets a lot of credit for that because he was very clear on that point in 2014 and has been clear on that ever since. And he also made a prediction which is, in a way, even more powerful, that back in 2001, 2002, when his great book was published, he said the relations between the U.S. and China are benign, but as China continues to grow, they will develop into hostility. And if you had asked me back then, 20 years ago, I would have said, come on, John, there's no reason for that hostility. And 20 years later, his prediction was accurate. So I give him a lot of predictive credit. But where we really differ is that I can't accept personally tragedy as being the state of affairs and the inevitable outcome. I think we can do better than that. And certainly there is a lot of cooperation in the world, in our own immediate lives, in our neighborhoods, in our cities, in our states, in our nation. And I believe that that can apply globally as well. Another point, though, as an economist, where I take exception to this is on two essential points. One is that I believe that there are great gains from trade. So that's pretty deeply embedded in economic thinking. It goes back in its clearest initial statement to Adam Smith in 1776 in The Wealth of Nations, but it's proved in innumerable theories and empirical studies ever since. So I want the world to be interconnected because I think it is good. But a second point is I believe the world is inevitably interconnected on profoundly important challenges, such as the survival of our oceans, our biodiversity, our ecosystems, our physical environment, which is being deeply deranged by the scale of human activity, now over $100 trillion per year scale of activity. And we need to cooperate. We're not in a position to allow anarchy to prevail. There's one even more important point, and that is that ever since the dawn of the thermonuclear age, and one could argue ever since the dawn of the atomic age in 1945, but certainly since the dawn of thermonuclear weapons, we are trapped on the edge of self-destruction, literal annihilation of our species. I take that very seriously So while we've had tragedies in the past, World War I, World War II, the 30 Years' War, innumerable tragedies that John Mearsheimer could explain very, very well, I believe we can't afford yet another tragedy of this kind, because in the thermonuclear age, everything is different. President Kennedy in 1963, in a famous peace speech, said, "I speak of peace because of the new face of war." And he said, because of the thermonuclear reality, it makes no sense to talk about war among the great powers. So for all of these reasons, I am a believer in the potential for cooperation, in the need for cooperation, in the benefits of cooperation. And that is my guiding set of principles.
So I'm glad you brought up John Mearsheimer's forecasts or predictions, whatever word you want to use, about the rise of China. He made those around the time of the commencement of the War on Terror, and that was where the United States began to focus geopolitically its energy on the Middle East. This was just a few years after China was admitted to the WTO. If treating Russia as a potential adversary enforced a climate of mutual hostility, why did the opposite not occur with China, given the fact that we've been so accommodating towards them? And why should the expectation have been, if we had been different towards Russia, that we wouldn't find ourselves in the mess that we find ourselves in today?
Well, actually, the treatment of Russia and China are the same, and the mindset is the same. What happened was that in 1991, December, when the Soviet Union dissolved, the American policy makers in the security state, and in this case, one politician played a very prominent role, and that was Dick Cheney, who was the Secretary of Defense of Bush Sr., said, okay, we did it. We've got it made. Our adversary has collapsed. The bipolar world has become the unipolar world. We can do what we want and should do what we want. That's good for us and good for the world. We've arrived at the unipolar moment. And that became the talisman of our age. Unipolarity, the indispensable nation, the most powerful colossus in the history of the world. These are things that Biden repeated until recent days. I think he's on a kind of memory loop, but that's another matter. But the basic point is that became the meme. I remember it very clearly among my international relations colleagues at Harvard in those days. There were many metrics of the U.S. as the sole superpower, the unchallenged superpower. Now, in those days, the idea that the U.S. would be challenged by Russia or China was unimaginable to these people. And China, much less than Russia. China was a nation of rice villages. It wasn't something that was on the radar screen.
Can I ask something really quick, though? You're correct, though, that the United States was the unipolar power. It was substantially more powerful than any country in the world. It was also the backstop to the international institutions. And so while you're correct in identifying Dick Cheney as being one of the sort of core advocates and then subsequently implementers of the neoconservative vision of U.S. foreign policy, which was very much more imperial, there were others who also wanted a strong American military and power, but for reasons that I think would have been more consistent with where you fell on the ideological spectrum, which was to support international institutions, to support the United Nations. So what would you say to that? I mean, is your view that the mistake was maintaining American power, that we should have demilitarized, or are you saying that the focus and the approach that was taken by the Bush administration in the 2000s was the fundamental problem?
There wasn't really that kind of debate. The debate arose over specifics. So first, back to China, no one imagined China as being anything more than an assembly shop for our phones and our computers and so forth, but certainly not any kind of threat in the remotest sense to the United States or any kind of rival. And the best proof of that, by the way, is to go back and read the documents of the 1990s. China's not mentioned in that context at all. So when it came to Russia, Russia was on its knees. And I wanted to help bring Russia back off its knees. I wanted major loans, debt relief, and so forth to get Russia back on its feet. That was viewed as kind of an absurdity by those who view the world as a zero-sum game. Why would we ever do that? Was the basic response. That's ridiculous. We've got them where we want them. Now, what we know is that the practical debate started within the Clinton administration on NATO. And the question was, well, what to do? Should we disband NATO? Should we welcome Russia into NATO? Should we emphasize the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE? Or should we build NATO? And this debate took place 1994, 1995. It pitted Madeleine Albright on one side, Bill Perry, the Secretary of Defense, on the other side of Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. And in the end, the Albright position prevailed. Clinton, as always, had domestic short-term political motives, thought it would be good for the Polish-American community and so on. But whatever it was, he came down on the side of Albright. Bill Perry thought about resigning. He said this was a cataclysmic mistake. After decades of virtual brinksmanship and often to the brink of nuclear war with the Soviet Union, we need to build confidence. He was doing that. He was meeting his Soviet counterparts. He said, why break all of this? Of course, George Kennan in 1997 famously wrote that this would be the most consequential error of the post-Cold War period. It would put us on a path to a new confrontation. And I think Kennan was the greatest scholar-statesman at that point. He had been on various sides of this debate since 1946, of course. But in any event, he was very, very clear. There were dozens of senior U.S. diplomats that said at the time, don't do this. This will just create trouble. But the idea really was, come on, Russia is so weak. It is so dependent on us. Anyway, we won, they lost, we go on. And the first move of NATO enlargement was Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic in 1999. And I think actually Russia swallowed hard. It resented it. It viewed it as contrary to the spirit of everything that had been discussed from 1990 onward. But these were countries away from Russia's borders. Things got worse in the next years. It certainly started with the NATO bombing of Belgrade, which was really an outrageous policy. It's a complete blot on American foreign policy and on Madeleine Albright. It was a deliberate war, whether to teach Milosevic a lesson, even though he was absolutely ready for many compromises, or whether it was to teach Holbrooke a lesson, because there's another theory which has a lot of credibility that she wanted to break any agreement that Holbrooke was negotiating with Milosevic in 1999, because if he succeeded, he would be the Secretary of State under Al Gore starting in 2001. So there's lots of gossip about this, but this was a disaster. And from the Russian point of view, this was an outrage. NATO bombing a European capital, a close ally of Russia and a historical, cultural ally of Russia, to break Serbia in two. And that was the next step. It has gone basically on that path from 1999 until today. And so it's not really right, in my view, that there were the kind of good guys that I'm more aligned with, the kind of bad guys, the neocons. There was a view that I think is a quite deep state view, consistent, carried out from the mid-1990s, first identified in 1992, implemented starting in the mid-1990s onward, lobbied for by the military industrial companies led by Lockheed Martin starting in 1996 for NATO enlargement, with great boosterism of none other than Joe Biden, of course, who's been at that particular game for a long time, spelled out quite vividly by Zbig Brzezinski in two places in 1997. One, a strategy for Eurasia, absolutely worth reading, from Foreign Affairs, 1997. And the second, The Global Chessboard, his long book on the same point. But the idea was American hegemony across Eurasia, essentially. Again, China did not loom large because it wasn't viewed as a serious threat. But Russia was viewed as a possible future competitor and worth surrounding, for sure, in the Black Sea.
So this is what I want to focus on, because I think the case that you're putting forward can certainly be made, right?
Oh, a lot of people made it, by the way. I'm not alone.
So yes, and as you pointed out, George Kennan, one of the most famous and admired diplomats in American history, wrote an op-ed published in 1997 saying this was a bad idea. In fact, I think the op-ed was titled "A Fateful Error." So this case has been made. What I want to try to understand is, so it's easy to see how this approach might have made things better. But what I want to try to understand is why you and others seem to feel that it necessarily would have, which is why I brought up the counterfactual of China's military rise, because we treated China very differently than we treated Russia. In fact, we treated China in many ways with open arms. I mentioned the accession of China into the WTO in 1999. Well, actually, an agreement was hammered out in 1999 that set the terms for its entry. It was then given most favored nation status by the U.S. Senate, which is kind of wild when you think about where we are today. And then it gained entry, I think, in 2001, around the same time that John Mearsheimer published The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, and around the same time that he published The Rise of China Will Not Be Peaceful. So if people like Mearsheimer were ringing the alarm bell about a potential future confrontation with assertive China in the early 2000s, at the peak of good relations between our two countries, why should we assume that if we had been more accommodative toward Russia, that we wouldn't find ourselves in a similar situation today?
Well, first of all, we don't need to be in the situation we're in with China. That's also U.S. created. But
why is that U.S. created?
Let's get to that,
Yeah,
but let's
sure.
stick with Russia first. And just to understand, look at economic indicators. China was way behind Russia in GDP per capita and in every other dimension of military power and possible concern for the United States back in 1997, 98, 99. So I'm trying to describe to you, not that we treated likes differently, we treated dislikes differently. We treated unlikes differently. In other words, China was just viewed naively, by the way, in some sense, because these are bad economists, but China was viewed as a poor country that was going to remain a poor country and not much concern to the United States. So that's why we approached China the way we did. Businesses were making money. They were an inexpensive source of inputs for our supply chains. We had the idea of triangulation still, that good relations with China wouldn't hurt in our influence and power over Russia and so on. So China was just not viewed in the same way, and it wasn't substantively for another decade. What Mearsheimer is right about is that when China became a sizable economy and a force in technological innovation and cutting edge technologies, then we changed our approach. That started in 2014, and that we can discuss at length.
And again, I don't remember exactly what John said, but John's view is one of structural realism.
That's correct.
And so there's a sort of embedded determinism associated with that, and a determinism associated with China's rise, and its economic rise and its military rise.
That's correct. And just to tell you, because I speak with him, he's my friend, and my interpretation, and this is how our conversation goes. I don't want to misrepresent him because I like him enormously and I give him all credit for this prediction. But I said, John, when we started treating China like an enemy, it's going to become an enemy. And he said, yes. And I said, John, that's going to make a self-fulfilling prophecy. He said, yes. I said, but John, That's terrible. We're going to have conflict. He said, yes. I said, John, that's a tragedy. Yes, Jeff, that's the tragedy. So John is not saying that China became powerful and then aggressive. He's saying what you said, and it's a very important distinction. China became large, and therefore we went to conflict. This is completely different.
Right, but it's different than saying it's America's fault. It is different than saying America caused China's rise as a military power.
No. This is wrong, and don't put words in my mouth, and don't misinterpret many things. China was militarily very weak, actually, for a country of that size and that economy. So it started, of course, to build its military. But we are in confrontation with China right now. That's a different matter. And that I blame a lot on the United States. And we can discuss that in detail. That's a different matter. I would expect that China, as a major economy, would have a military that's not a tiny fraction of ours in many strategic areas. This makes sense, especially the way the U.S. behaves. But to have the kind of conflict we have right now is quite a different matter. But if we could just go back to keep the thread, because what happened with China started around 2014, the change of American mood. It didn't start in Obama 1. It's a phenomenon of Obama 2, second term. But before that, the situation with Russia completely poisoned. And it's important to understand why that is. And that is essentially because the U.S. security state assumed, absolutely, not only as a strategy and as a set of tactics, but as a matter of fact, that the U.S. could do what it wants. And there's the famous discussion of Wesley Clark, which is very interesting and insightful. Wesley Clark famously going to the Pentagon after 9/11 and getting a list of all the wars the U.S. is about to start.
The 7 countries memo.
Yeah. He says, what are you talking about? He says, yes, this is what we're going to do. And why? Because if you listen to Cheney, if you read Rebuilding America's Defenses of the Project of the New American Century, if you look at the policymaking of Bush, especially after 9/11, but even, I would say, before 9/11, at least to the extent that the PNAC was a major player, the idea was we are powerful, we are unipolar, we will be strong, and we will exercise what they call the constabulary duties. We will be the world's policeman. You know, some of us use that as a pejorative expression. What do you think? We're the world's policeman? And they used it as an absolute positive. When you read Rebuilding America's Defenses, they say, of course, we need to assume the constabulary duties of the world. That's good. We will be the world's policeman. Okay, what that meant was we're going to clean up all these retrograde, lingering, former Soviet allied countries, Syria, Iraq, Libya. We're going to take out these governments. And one by one, they tried to do so. And it's been, in my view, a complete debacle, a complete waste of money. But from Russia's point of view, they kind of had their jaw open. You know, after 9/11, the first reaction was, okay, we'll help you, even in Afghanistan. But the reaction to Iraq was, what the hell are you doing? We have relations there. And then one thing happened after another, which needs to be understood. And the American public knows very little about it. But one of the most decisive things that happened in 2002 was the unilateral U.S. withdrawal from the anti-ballistic missile treaty, which Russia had put great stock in as a stabilizing measure. They did not want an arms race with the U.S. over this. They didn't feel in a position to have an arms race with the U.S. And suddenly the ABM treaty and the intention to station anti-ballistic missiles, the Aegis missile systems, first in Poland and then Romania. So that was 2002. It followed 1999. It followed then ABM. Then 2003 was Iraq, which was another shock to the system. Then in 2004 was 7 more countries admitted to NATO. This was Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia. Take a look at the map. You're getting awfully close to Russia with that. 7 more countries. And the Russians said, are you kidding? What the hell are you doing? And we know a lot about that because 2 notable documents from 2007 and 2008 are well worth reading. One is Putin's speech to the Munich Security Conference in 2007, where he said, come on, we have tried to cooperate. We wanted to cooperate. We wanted to support you in the war on terror, but your behavior is really completely threatening to us. So that's the first speech. And he said, don't even dream of Ukraine in this. And remember that Zbigniew Brzezinski laid out the NATO enlargement to Ukraine in 1997. So this is important to understand. These are long-term plans. These are not politicians' plans. These are deep state plans. They get implemented with very little change, fixed rudder over a 20, 25-year period. And that's what happened.